give a little background. I've known Rebecca for 37 years. And I'm going to read an excerpt from my first and only sermon that I gave to this congregation 10 years ago. I'm not going to read the whole thing, just 2 paragraphs. In 1985, I took a few years off from a busy schedule to visit the library of the seminary. We used to have a library up there. I don't know if we still do. I selected a copy of Sojourner's magazine with a compelling article by the theologian Jim Wallace, who wrote about a group called Witness for Peace. Wallace had formed this interdenominational group to serve as witness to the atrocities being supported by the U.S. government in Nicaragua 35 years ago. Wallace believed that we as citizens had a responsibility to speak up against this war based on what he saw and experienced in the war zone with the people. He believed that to remain silent was to be complicit. To remain silent was to be complicit. I was one of several thousand men and women who volunteered over a period of 2 or 3 years to participate with Witness for Peace. My group of 20 volunteers, including Rebecca, a mix of Quakers, Catholics, Jews, atheists, young and old, gay and straight, bonded like family in the weeks we traveled through that beautiful country by bus and state bed. One of our leaders, Don Chase, was a retired Presbyterian minister in his 80s. He was a most remarkable man of grace, courage, and humor. Do you remember Don? Who could be fierce when he directed his anger at the Secret Service officer who spoke to us at the U.S. consulate in Nicaragua. Those weeks were some of the fullest, most exhilarating, joyful, and heart-rending days of my life, and Don was a role model of a man of deep faith who dared to go where the battle raged. I miss him, but I see his spirit here in this church. Nicaraguans say that our presence with Witness for Peace prevented the planned invasion. So this is my introduction for Rebecca. Today, Rebecca Gordon will be talking to us about the worldwide immigration crisis that is occurring at the southern border and in Gaza today. Rebecca is the rare academic who has spent years in the front lines at home and abroad, including 6 months as a witness in the war zones of Nicaragua during the U.S.-supported Contra war. She is a gift and a wonderful speaker. She is a woman of deep faith who dared to go where the battle raged. Rebecca received her BA from Reed College and her Master of Divinity and Ph.D. in Ethics and Social Theory from Graduate Theological Seminary. She taught in the Department of Philosophy and for the Leo T. McCarthy Center for Public Service and the Common Good at the University of San Francisco. Previous publications include Letters from Nicaragua and Cruel and Unusual, How Welfare Reform Punishes Poor People. When she last spoke to us several years ago, she talked about her book, Mainstreaming Torture, and that is a book that we used to talk about here in this church and with a small group. This is a wonderful book, and then you can go online and find this article at Tom's Dispatch. That's a recent article that Rebecca wrote, and it's titled, Give Me Shelter. Here's Rebecca.
Peter, thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I have to say I feel very comfortable because this is almost like an Episcopal church, nobody in the front row. But I was very happy to have an opportunity to come in. I was a little late, but to hear today's sermon and to think especially about this call to pay attention. And I have a feeling that this is a congregation where people are constantly paying attention. And one of the effects of paying attention is that one begins to become aware of so much pain that sometimes it's more than we can bear. And so that's when I'm glad I'm a nice Jewish girl who goes to an Episcopal church, because I can imagine a God who is able to bear the pain that we find unbearable. So that's, I heard recently a pair of definitions of the words empathy and compassion. And this is just one person's take on that distinction, but the idea is that empathy is the capacity to feel what another person is feeling, to have that emotional experience. And compassion is the ability to have that feeling and then to make an action in response to that feeling. And so that's my hope for what we talk about today, is that it incites us in one way or another to take action and not simply to live with the pain that so many people in the world are going through. So that's what I want to talk about, and I thought I would get some definitions out of the way, because when we talk about refugees, I know that that this church and members of this church are doing some work at the US-Mexico border. And that work is just so important. And there's a way in which the people at that border who are coming less now from the northern triangle of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, although still many, but now from all over the world, from Cuba, from Africa, from Afghanistan, from China, all over the world, people are arriving at that southern border trying to come into the United States. And there they're running into a very well-intentioned piece of international law that makes it very difficult for so many people to move around in the world. And that is the Geneva, the International Convention on Refugees. And I'm going to read to you the definition from that 1949 convention, because what happened was after World War II, as many of you know, people were displaced all over Europe, and there were people who were internally displaced within their own national bounds, and then there were people who had nowhere to go, who were seeking refuge, hence refugees, from the various things that had happened in the war. And so the original definition of a refugee was as the following: as a result of events occurring before the 1st of January 1951, and owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or particular political opinion, whoever in that condition is outside the country of his nationality and is unable, or owing to that fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality, and that of course touches on the group of people who are currently suffering in Gaza, the Palestinians, right? Not having a nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence, as a result of such events, is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to return to it. So a refugee is a person who has a validated fear of persecution based on who they are in one of these various dimensions. And this is the law, and then what the convention went on to say is that all of the signatory countries, and there are 146 of them today, all the countries that signed that convention would receive and grant asylum to people who fit this international legal definition of a refugee. Well, time went on, and it happened as the 20th century continued its long and terrible history, that more and more people were being created as refugees. The people in the shadow of World War II, I think, 1951, 6 years after the war had ended, people couldn't imagine that there would be similar terrible international war of this nature again. They couldn't imagine that once again people would create populations of refugees, but of course that happened. And so in 1967, there was an additional protocol added on to the existing law that basically took the sentence about as a result of events happening before 1951 out of it. So now it's anyone who finds themselves in that situation, right? But here's the unintended consequence of that, which is that the nations that have signed this convention are required by international law to accept everyone who meets the criteria for a refugee. And we now call these people asylum seekers, right? But what that means is that there is a huge class of other people who do not have any legal right, no matter how terrible their situation may be, no matter whether their farming, their subsistence farming has been completely destroyed by changes to the climate, no matter whether they are unable to live because there is no work in their countries, no matter what the economic situation, no matter if their children are starving. If it's not a result of persecution based on their membership in a particular group, these people become what are called economic migrants. And they do not have the same rights under international law. And so, and you probably already know this, what happens at the border, the southern border of the United States, is this kabuki theater of an attempt to discern between those people who have legitimate fear of persecution and those people who are merely starving to death, right? And this is, the current legal situation of the literally hundreds of thousands of people who attempt to cross every month in 2023 into this country. Now, the reality is that human beings have always moved around the earth. Ever since the first, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals decided to make a move north out of Africa and see what might be across that sea, or get around to, parts of Asia or Polynesia or the continent of Australia. People have always moved around. It's only been in the last 200 years or so that there's been law and borders that keep people from moving around. This is a very new, a modern phenomenon. My grandfather was raised in the Ukraine, or what we now call Ukraine, in a little town near Sebastopol, near Odessa. And one day in 1910, the Cossacks came to his village. He was a Jew. And they attacked his family and they killed one of the children in his family. He was the eldest son. So his parents put him on a hayrick under bales of hay, and he was driven out of that town on this horse cart. And he managed to walk and hitch rides across most of Europe until he got to Antwerp in Belgium. And he got on a boat and he sailed to Ellis Island to New York City because he had a distant cousin who lived in Norfolk, Virginia. And a few years ago, it's been 15 years ago now almost, the website for Ellis Island opened up. And I was able to actually go online and find a photograph of the ship that my grandfather came in and find the page of the ship's manifest that had his name listed on it with the address in Norfolk, Virginia, where he was going. In 1910, the question he was asked was, "Are you an anarchist?" 10 years later, that question was changed to, "Are you a communist?" But the point was they were still trying to keep people out who were either sick or who could in some way poison the blood of the people, as a certain presidential candidate might say. So, but the point is, he was able to come to the United States. We did not yet have the kinds of immigration rules that we later developed in the 1920s and then which have been changed since then, the last significant change being in '86 with the IRCA laws. Those laws didn't exist. And in fact, the great strength, economic power of this country was built first on unwilling immigrants, the enslaved people who were brought here and built essentially the wealth not only of the southern United States but of the textile industry and the beginning industries in the northern United States. None of that would exist without the work of those people. Similarly, the great industrial power of this country depended on immigrants coming to this country. Today, you'll notice that on the right wing there is this fear that white people are going to be replaced, right? The great replacement theory, by people of a different color. And there's always been debate. And if you go back and look at the census definitions, the definition of who is white and who is not white changes over time. It's, these are constructed categories. They're not real categories. But there is this fear among some right-wing white people that white people are no longer going to be the majority in this country, and that there is, a plot to swell the ranks of people who are not white in this country, either to keep the Democrats in power or for simply out of a craven desire to poison the blood of the people. The truth is that part of the reason why people are so afraid is that the birth rate of white people is falling in this country. Not only are we going to be a minority at some point, but in fact, we're having fewer children. And there are lots of reasons for that. And so if this magnificent economic structure that is the US economy is going to survive, we're going to have more people to do the work, and those people are not being born here in this country. Okay, so something about refugees, something about what's going on there. I wanted to talk a little bit about Gaza. So let me ask you first, who here, I think there are people here who actually have been to the occupied territories, which I never have. I've been to Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. In 2006. In fact, because of the order in which we did the trip, we went to visit my friend Tina Nachash, who is a Lebanese who lives in Beirut, and we had originally planned to go and visit her after we did the other part of the trip to Jordan and Syria, and with Global Exchange. And she said, no, you should come first because it's only going to get hotter and it'll be nicer. Well, if we had done it in the opposite order, we would have been in Lebanon during Israel's last war against Lebanon, right? She took us all over the country. We went down to the southern border where Hezbollah is powerful, and we stood in the top of a castle that was built by crusaders, right? And there were Hezbollah flags all over it. And we looked out at the Israeli towns that were just across the border. The places that Hezbollah is sending missiles into. But I've never been to Israel. My father wanted to go to Israel with me, and we never did. And I think it would have been very hard for me because we had a kind of a tacit agreement that we would just never, ever discuss that part of the world because terrible things would be said by both of them. His father, the one who came to Norfolk, later in the 30s was the president of his local Zionist club, right? At a time when Zionism represented a hope for Jews of a place of safety at a time, both in the United States and of course in Europe, when the situation of Jews was becoming ever more dangerous. So from my father's point of view, Israel was always the place that we could go if things were really terrible. Later on, that place became Canada. So in 1968, my dad said to me, if Nixon gets arrested, I'm taking us all to Canada. And Nixon did get elected, and we didn't go to Canada. But I am reminded, that if he were still alive today, he would be saying to me, if Trump gets elected again, we're going to Canada. And in fact, Canada would probably take me because I'm a nice white girl with skills, right? And that's, what it comes down to when it comes to taking economic or political migrants. So let's talk about Gaza. Who can tell me something about Gaza? What do you know about it? What do you know about Gaza?
Dense population.
Dense population. How many people?
2 million.
2.2.
Yeah, 2.3.
Well, until they started being killed.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I did the math this morning, about 1% of the people who were living there before October 7th have actually been killed. And that doesn't include people who are buried under rubble. So imagine, if there were 100 of us in this room, one at least would have died, would have been killed. And it seems clear that the majority of those people have been women and children. So very densely populated. I spent some time on the island of Martha's Vineyard off Cape Cod. And it's a little island. It's about 20 miles long, about 10 miles wide at the widest. And the population in the winter is about 15,000. In the summer, it's 150,000, and it feels so crowded. Gaza's about the same size as that island. Imagine 2.3 million people, right? One of the most densely populated places in the world. What else do you know about it?
It's an outdoor prison.
Okay, and why do you say that?
Because they can't go anywhere. There's walls or barbed wire or whatever it is, and Israeli soldiers everywhere, and they can't leave.
Right, and on the other side is what?
The ocean.
The ocean. Yeah, exactly.
The naval blockade.
With a naval blockade, exactly. So every time there is a war or a set of skirmishes between Israel and Hamas, there is the blockade increases and the kinds of goods that are allowed in are reduced. So one of the things that has happened continually in Gaza is that not at the level that we're seeing now, but that housing has been destroyed, has been bombed. But people have not been allowed to bring in rebar and concrete to rebuild, right? So Gaza was already suffering from the effects of previous wars. Why does Israel get to run Gaza? How did that happen? Yeah.
I forget which war it was, but that was taken during a war where Israel prevailed.
The 1967, exactly. So in 67, Israel seized what we call the West Bank, which is the west side of the Jordan River, and the Golan Heights, which is this mountainous region in Syria, and this little strip of land called Gaza. And the people in Gaza, the majority of them are descendants of people who had to leave the Mediterranean coast there in 1948 and during what Israel calls its War of Independence and what Palestinians call the Nakba, or the disaster, the catastrophe, and have ended up in this little strip of land. So I brought some maps just because I think I don't know about you, but I like to be able to see where things are. And I've got 6 of these. So if you can just share them out maybe. And the first map is just of the whole region that we're talking about, what we call the Middle East. And I'll make sure maybe you can share with these folks. So, and you'll notice that I've got Yemen there in red. So recently the United States has decided that it's not satisfied with the number of wars we've got going, and we need to have a war against the Houthis in Yemen. And I'm not going to go into the whole history of the Houthi movement and who they are, but if you look at where they are, you can see there's that narrow little entrance to the Red Sea. And something like 10% of all of the sea traffic in the world goes through that narrow little entrance. And that's how, and then it goes to the Suez Canal, and it gets into the Mediterranean. And that's how this not very powerful group of people has managed to actually constrict the flow of, the worldwide flow of naval traffic. And this map also gives you a picture and helps you understand why this particular area is of so much interest to the United States, right? One piece has to do with that Red Sea and the Suez Canal, and we won't go into 1956 and when Egypt took back the Suez Canal. But the other piece has to do, of course, with the other countries that are there, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, which are rich in what particular resource? Oil. There you go, right? And so, especially in the post-war period, up until really extremely recently, until the United States figured out about fracking and was able to wean itself off of petroleum, control of that petroleum flow was crucial to international economic power. So that's one reason. And so the idea, part of the reason for the US's adamant, indefatigable support for the nation of Israel is that they needed to have a friend in that part of the world at a time when they needed to have control over the flow of petroleum. It's not the only reason, there are other reasons, but that's one of them. So the next map I have is about what we were just talking about, to show you a map of the area of Israel-Palestine itself, with the West Bank and Gaza sort of picked out. Yeah.
One thing that I don't understand is the location. Well, the history of the settlements and the impact of that on all of this.
Okay, so
because it seems to me that that's probably one of the greatest concerns of the Palestinian people.
Absolutely. So when we talk about settlements, what we're talking about is housing developments, basically, that have been built in that area that's called the West Bank. It's called the West Bank because it's on the left or the west side of the Jordan River, right? On the other side of that river are other countries. And so when people say from the river to the sea, they mean from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. So when the Oslo Accords were signed, and the Oslo Accords go, all the way back to, oh God, I'm going to get the year wrong. I think it's 1980, but it might be a little later than that. When those accords were signed, that was when this thing called the Palestinian Authority was created. And the idea was that this Palestinian Authority would have a lot of control, but also a lot of responsibility in this area that Israel had seized in 1967 called the West Bank, and also in Gaza, and less so in the Golan Heights, but in those two areas. And the idea was that, in theory, eventually, there would be two states, and that the Palestinian state would be this discontinuous two pieces of territory, the West Bank, which is much bigger, and Gaza, which actually has almost as many people as the West Bank in it. So they asked Ariel Sharon, who was the prime minister of Israel for a time and was the person who was behind the massacres in two Palestinian refugee camps, Sabila and Shatil, in southern Lebanon in 1982 or 3, somewhere in there. Ariel Sharon was asked after the Oslo Accords, well, what's your plan for the Palestinians? And he said, we're going to slice them up like a pastrami sandwich. And the idea, even then, was that they would use the strategic use of planting settlements so that there would be so many Jewish Israelis living in the West Bank that it would become impossible to actually create a contiguous Palestinian state, because these housing developments would essentially slice up the West Bank. Now, I haven't been to the West Bank, but Beverly has. Maybe you can say a little bit about what you saw.
It got much worse from 2008 to 2015.
Uh-huh.
So some of my dearest friends here are, like Tom, were on the trip in 2008 that was sponsored by this church. And we went to settlements and listened to the official speakers from settlements. And the settlement population is very clearly convinced that the Bible is a real estate grant, and that they are entitled to the entire Holy Land. And they also are, I think, pretty seriously convicted that the Palestinians are not fully human. Yeah. And are not capable of actually owning and tending property. So it's very disturbing to listen to the philosophy and the beliefs of the appointed speakers from the settlements. So the settlements have just been growing and growing and growing.
Yeah.
And annexing more and more land that should have been part of the Palestinian state.
And for a while, it was more or less on the down low, but with the new, far, far right-wing government that we have, or that Israel has today, this is now official policy. Yes. And that's, it is in direct contravention of international laws and customs of war. It's very clear that countries that are occupying land that has been seized in war are not, and by the way, where was the West Bank seized from? From the country of Jordan. Okay, so that land used to be Jordan. And in fact, vast numbers of Palestinians live still in Jordan, in Syria, and in Lebanon, and have grown up for generations now in refugee camps, which they're called camps, but they're essentially cities. So this policy of building these settlements comes along with the policy of creating walls of separation, and you're apparently using the word wall is very offensive to Israeli sensitivities, and it's meant to be called a barrier. But it's concrete, it's a wall. It's the model for the wall that Donald Trump wanted to build on our southern border, right? And it separates Palestinians from Jewish Israelis, and there are literally different highways that one group is allowed to use. There are hundreds of checkpoints all over the West Bank where you have to stop and be checked every time you want to move from one place to another. There are, then when it comes to Gaza, what happened with Gaza was a decision that Israel made that it was basically ungovernable and that they no longer wanted to have any kind of responsibility. I should explain that with the creation of the Palestinian Authority, you may wonder how did the US come to be this big power broker in the creation of this Oslo Pact? And the answer is that the US funds the Palestinian Authority. That's the deal, is we provide the money, and the Palestinian Authority, unfortunately, also receives money from the government of Israel and has become unintentionally, to the extent that it functions at all, it's become the enforcer for Israeli policy in the West Bank. And it's a hard and conflicted position to be in, but it's part of the reason why the newer organization, Hamas, which is not all that new, but why it was able to supplant the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, because the PA was really viewed as being, 85% complicit with the occupation. And so that part of, especially among younger Palestinians who have grown up under occupation and who have seen, tremendous corruption, and there hasn't been a presidential election in the Palestinian Authority for over a decade. And there's this sense that, where is our leadership, right? I just want to add a couple other things about what's going on. Thomas Friedman, who drives me crazy, was interviewed by Ezra Klein the other day. And one of the things he said is, what if millions of Palestinians had decided, instead of the horrors of October 7th, and I don't want anyone to walk away from here thinking that I don't think that what happened on October 7th was anything but hideous crimes, right? But what if instead of this violent response, there had been this massive nonviolent response of Palestinians? Well, guess what? That's been going on for decades, right? So a few years ago, there was the Great Return, which was nonviolent marches of thousands and thousands of Palestinians to these border fences, saying, you know, many of them holding the keys to the homes that their parents and grandparents had been removed from, and saying, you know, we want to return to our homes. And what happened to these people? People were shot. People were murdered in cold blood by the Israeli Defense Forces. And that's not, you know, that's what you expect when you are willing to engage in genuine nonviolent action. You know that you are putting yourself in genuine harm's way. And people did that. There's another movement, an international movement that is nonviolent, right? I see people nodding their heads, that could have tremendous effect on Israel. It had a tremendous effect on South Africa. During the South African a period of apartheid from 1948 up until the end of legal apartheid in the 90s, there were, in the 80s and 90s, there were campaigns of boycotting the South African government, boycotting artifacts, things that were made in South Africa. There was an embargo on shipping US technology to South Africa. Now, I actually had a chance to spend a few months working at an anti-apartheid newspaper in 1990 in Cape Town, and the truth was you could get anything. And there were all these books that were banned because they were opposed to apartheid, but you could go to the mall in Cape Town and buy them. But I'll tell you one boycott that had tremendous effect on South Africa, and that was the sports boycott. Because sports was so deeply embedded in white South African culture that being excluded from things like the Olympics and other international sports was felt profoundly by that country. So there is a movement called BDS, right? Boycott, divest, sanction. And the idea is that just as South Africa was placed under tremendous economic stress by these boycotts, to the point where they finally realized, for that reason and many other reasons, mainly through the incredible bravery and actions of the African National Congress, the ANC, but the international pressure made a difference. Well, do you know that in many states in the United States, it is illegal to campaign for boycotting Israeli goods, for divesting from Israeli countries, for asking for economic sanctions on Israel? It's illegal. It's against state law. And in fact, here is this effort that people have made all over this country to try to build, and all over the world, to build a nonviolent resistance to the occupation. And it's been treated as not only illegitimate, but as essentially the equivalent of the kind of anti-Semitism that led to the destruction of 6 million of my people, right? The Holocaust. So when people say, well, why don't they resist nonviolently? My answer is many, many, many people do, and have, and continue to. And I think the message for us here in this country is that our responsibility is to put pressure on our government to stop supporting what we're supporting today, and that includes to continue putting pressure on Joe Biden and on his government to stop the support, the economic and military support without which Israel would not be able to function. There have been stories in mainstream press suggesting that the US has actually even assisted in targeting in the war against Gaza. And that is a level of involvement that goes beyond just money and armaments. So I think we have a tremendous responsibility as people living in this country to educate ourselves, to pay attention, to listen to God's word, because God's word is all around us, as Scott said today. And I think God's word is saying, when a genocide is happening, we have to stand up and say, no, not in our name, stop. So that's the thing I want to finish with, is the South African case at the International Court of Justice. So here's into the weeds. There are two international courts that get confused. One is called the International Criminal Court, and the other is called the International Court of Justice. It's also known as the World Court. The International Court of Justice is where nations can sue each other. So back in 1983, Nicaragua sued the United States because we had put mines in the harbors on the Atlantic and the Pacific coasts of Nicaragua. Now, mining a harbor is an act of war. And in fact, those weapons are considered to be what's called in just war theory, mala en se, evil in and of themselves, because they are indiscriminate. Once a mine is planted, whether on land or in the water, you have no control over whether it detonates and what sets it off, right? So the US actually was taken to court by Nicaragua. The World Court found in Nicaragua's favor and said the US had to pay $5 million, which in those days was more money than it is now. Do you think that the US court paid $5 million to Nicaragua? No. But the other court, the International Criminal Court, is much newer. It was envisioned by the people who did the trials at Nuremberg, and I have another book called American Nuremberg, which is about the war crimes in the so-called War on Terror. But in the context of that, I wrote a bunch about Nuremberg. But one of the things, the idea was that this tribunal would be an example of the kind of international tribunal that could exist continually in order to try people who were guilty of war crimes who could not be tried for one reason or another by their own countries. Well, it took from 1945 until 1984 even longer, 1990, for this court to begin to be created through a statute that's called the Rome Statute, because that's where this international law was signed. And the idea was it would be created as a place to try war criminals who couldn't be tried in other places. The US signed the initial statute, but in 2002, at the height of the beginning of the ramping up of the global war on terror, the United States sent a letter to the UN saying that we were withdrawing from the International Criminal Court, that we would no longer be part of that court because they already knew the torture that was going on under the CIA and various parts of the US military, and they did not want to see people from the United States hauled up to The Hague to stand trial for war crimes. And so we withdrew. And we have still not gone back to the ICC, even though we routinely cheer on its activities. But the World Court, the International Court of Justice, is also at The Hague. And this is where South Africa very recently went to the World Court and said, on an emergency basis, there is a genocide happening in Gaza. And one of the things I brought here is the definition within the covenant that we've signed against genocide. And it says, the contracting parties, that is, all of the countries that have signed this thing, confirm that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, is a crime under international law which they undertake to prevent and to punish. And the International World Court of Justice is one of the ways that that crime can be punished. Article 2 in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical or ethnic, racial or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And South Africa put together the most extraordinary set of briefing papers that detailed not only the actual actions that have been taken in Gaza, the 25,000, probably up to 26,000 confirmed named dead, the destruction of now more than 3/4 of all of the hospitals in Gaza, the destruction of hundreds of schools, the multiple attacks on places that had previously been designated as safe areas and safe shelters, the attack on UN workers, and within the context of this definition, said this is genocide and it needs to be stopped. The South Africans called for a ceasefire. The justices at the court made a sort of Solomonic decision, in a sense, and they said, Israel was attacked on October 7th. Israel has a right to self-defense. Therefore, they did not call for an immediate ceasefire, but what they did call was for Israel to stop doing all of the things that are on this list that define genocide. So they continue to be permitted to defend themselves, but they are not permitted to continue to enact what is a genocide. Now, the actual judgment of the court is going to take probably 3 or 4 years. So this was just sort of like a stay, right? It's like if a judge issues an injunction and says, while we're considering this case, you have to stop doing this. And that's essentially what the World Court has done. I'm going to talk about one more thing, which is UNRWA, and end with a little bit of good news. Okay, so UNRWA is the UN Works and what is its exact name? UN Relief and Works Agency. Okay, so after World War II, one of the first groups of people who became new refugees were Palestinians, because in 1948, the Israeli War of Independence made refugees of millions of people living in that land who were not Jews. Palestinians, as they call themselves. And Christians, Muslims, all kinds of people, but Palestinians. And the UN realized that those people were going to need an organized form of relief, that they were living as refugees, not in a position to take care of themselves economically. And so this organization, UNRWA, was created specifically to address the needs of Palestinian refugees. It soon became clear that there were going to be refugees all over the world. And so the UN has another, and this is like an accident of history, right? The UN has another organization that addresses the needs of refugees everywhere else in the world. And it's the UN High Commission on Refugees. But Palestinians have this specific agency, UNRWA, that to this day in Gaza was operating many of the hospitals, the schools, the clinics, the provision of of material aid, because when you lock 2.3 million people into a very small area and there's very little space for economic activity, those people end up having to live on the generosity, the handouts of the international community. And that's what's happened. And so very recently, you may have heard that the Israeli government has identified 12 employees of UNRWA. UNRWA has upwards of 70,000 employees. It's probably the biggest employer by far in Gaza. But of those 70,000, 12 were identified as having actually participated in the horrendous actions of October 7th. UNRWA immediately, even before there were trials or anything, they looked at whatever evidence Israel presented to them and they fired those people. Some of them had already died, had been killed in the course of the war, but they were fired. What has the United States and Britain and France and Canada and what have been the responses of the major donor countries that fund UNRWA?
Stop donation.
Say it again?
Cut off the money.
Cut off the money, exactly, right? So now UNRWA, because it's not entirely shocking that among 70,000 employees, there would be supporters of Hamas and even people who participated in this horrific attack, right? So the United States has decided that the proper response, is to cut off that money, which means that the little tiny bit of aid that has been trickling into Gaza since the war began is going to be made even smaller. And Antonio Guterres, who's the Secretary General of the UN, has been saying now for months, this has to stop, there has to be a ceasefire. Now he is begging these donor countries to, continue funding UNRWA. You can actually fund UNRWA yourself. You can go online and find a way to send them money. And the money that individuals send is important, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to what these these governments can send. So I just want us to be aware that this is another way that the Gazans, who I swear it's a country, it's a group of people who are living the life of Job, right? It's like, what else can be done to them? And here's one more thing, right? And I just want us to be aware that what UNRWA actually is, what its role in Gaza actually is, how important it is to the lives, not only of people in Gaza, but also the West Bank, in the camps in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan as well, right? To cut off aid to UNRWA is to cut off aid that millions of people depend on. So I want us to understand that this is, to say the least, like Israel's response, disproportionate to what actually happened. Yeah?
Was that decision on our government's point, was it based simply on the fact that there were these 12 individuals,
Yeah.
or was it pressure from outside, like for example Israel?
I don't think so. I think it was actually, okay, my take, and I'm not, a global strategist, but my take is that the US is working hard behind the scenes to try to mitigate to some extent the Israeli response, because it's so horrendous. And so it's possible that the US, as a sweetener to Israel, is willing to do this temporarily. I don't think this is going to be a permanent cutoff, but people will die in the meantime because they don't have access to the aid they need. But I think that eventually the US is going to go back to, and these other countries will go back. So my guess is that this is a sweetener because the New York Times has been reporting for the last 2 days that there is a possibility of a genuine cessation of hostilities. I'm not going to call it a ceasefire, but a genuine truce is, and this was the good news I wanted to end with, right, that through mediation by Qatar and the U.S., it looks as though there is a move towards a deal which would free first the group of remaining women and children who are hostages who being held in Gaza by Hamas or other organizations that Hamas doesn't have much control over. So that first tranche, in return for stopping the war and presumably the release of some of the people who are held in prisons by Israel, and they're called prisoners. You could just as easily call them hostages because many of them, the majority, are detained without any kind of trial or anything. And many of them are young. They're like under 18, and have done terrible things like throw stones. So the idea is that there'd be a month truce, and this first group of people would be released. Then there would be a second truce for another month, during which the remaining hostages, so the men and any non-civilian hostages that are being held in Gaza, would be released. We don't know what will happen after that, but even the possibility that there would be a stand down temporarily would be life-saving for hundreds of thousands of people. So this is the good news. The less good news is that Israel has absolutely no idea what it plans to do with Gaza afterwards, right? An Israeli real estate company, they say it was a joke, but they put up a whole thing about you can have waterfront property on the Mediterranean in Gaza. We're going to be building condos. They later said that this was just a joke. They didn't actually mean it. But it's very funny, huh? But the truth is that many people high up in the Israeli administration, including Netanyahu, have said their goal is to get people out of Gaza, to deplete it, And Nikki Haley, the savior from Trump, said early on at the beginning, well, if Egypt had just opened up their gates, all the Palestinians could have gone to Egypt. And so, one plan actually is to put them, and if you'll look at your map, you'll see, here, this is Gaza, here's Rafah, here's Egypt. This part of Egypt is what's called the Sinai Peninsula. It's a desert. Nobody lives there. And the idea is to put 2.3 million Palestinians there. Well, Egypt is saying, no, it ain't me. It ain't me. But clearly the desire is to somehow rid Gaza of these people. And that's what makes it a genocide. Yeah.
I lived in Jordan in 1986.
Oh my gosh.
I was helping document conditions in the refugee camps.
Oh, okay, so you know more about it than I do.
In Jordan, and they were absolutely horrendous. We saw sewage flowing through the streets, and what was shocking was these people had been displaced into Jordan after I think it was the
67 war?
67 war, and this is 1986, and
right.
The conditions were absolutely
horrendous.
Terrible, horrendous. Yeah. And what I learned was that nobody really wants the Palestinians. After the 67 war, the Palestinians flooded Jordan,
right.
And the Hashemite kingdom, King Hussein at the
right.
time, literally massacred the Palestinians. It was called Black September.
Yep.
Because they were then using Jordan as a base for the PLO
right.
to target Israel.
Right.
And
Jordan didn't want to get into a war with
it destabilized Jordan.
Yeah,
and there were Palestinians that were integrated into Jordan, but a large proportion of them were in the refugee camps.
Right, and could not become citizens.
And they could not become citizens. But the ones that were there, I got to spend time with, visited their homes, and they told me stories about how they would go back to the West Bank and cross the Allenby Bridge, and be stopped there, searched, oftentimes being stripped naked, having to stand and crouch in the rain for 8 hours while their clothes were thrown into a pile.
Yep.
And so I would see, posters of Yasser Arafat in their homes and stuff, and these young people that I got to know were very militant.
Yes.
And we asked, well, why are they militant? It's because this is what this ongoing process of humiliation and degradation, has continued. And it just grows more and more militants that result in the horrendous acts of October 7th.
Exactly.
And this is, some people have said this is going to be, another several generations of extremists that will
Of trauma.
that will go.
Yeah.
I just want to tag on with respect to my colleague Nick's statement, because when people, I have spent a lot of time in peacemaking groups, sitting for years with the Marin rabbis, and when people say, very often, the pro-Israel people that I listen to say, nobody wants the Palestinians, and that functions to dehumanize
Absolutely.
the Palestinian people.
Yeah.
And I think we need to say that with great care.
Absolutely.
As Donald Trump is reelected and puts a blockade around the state of California, I don't think Mexico or Canada is going to want all of us either.
Right.
That doesn't mean that we are not fully human and entitled to human rights.
Absolutely right. And this is the horror of being a stateless person, right? Is you don't have that claim to the same level of humanity. And as one of the things I wrote about in Mainstreaming Torture is that what makes it possible for people to torture is precisely that dehumanization of the object, of the target, right? You make that person into, and you use the language, you call them vermin, you call them cockroaches, you call them all kinds of names that don't, that are not human, right? And the day may come when even non-human animals actually receive more attention from humans than they do today. But certainly, at the very least, we owe it to people who share, to creatures who share our nature, that we recognize their humanity. And you're absolutely right, this nobody wants the Palestinians. It's what my father always used to say, right? Why don't the Arabs take them?
Yeah.
Do you see a moral difference between the Warsaw Uprising and the October 7th Uprising?
I don't know enough about the methods of the Warsaw Uprising to say. I see an equivalence in the sense of desperation on both sides. I think that the use of rape in war is something that has always happened and has also happened in the context of the October 7th. And I don't know whether that happened in Warsaw. I think it makes a difference how, so in just war theory, there's like the justice before the war, which is like the causes, right? And I would say Warsaw and the October 7th, very similar justice in the cause. There's jus in bello, the justice during the war, and that's about how you conduct the war. And I think that, as I say, I don't know enough about Warsaw to say whether they were equivalent. I will say that it is wrong not to make a distinction between civilians and military. That's the bedrock of international humanitarian law, right? Is this distinction between people who are combatants and people who are not, which is why the US went to so much trouble to say that people who were fighting against the US in Afghanistan were illegal combatants, that they didn't fall under this category, and so therefore they weren't entitled to certain rights. So I don't know, I think, but the third piece is justice after the war, right? And of course, that's something that applies mainly to the people who win. How do they behave after the war? And what we have in the case of 1967 is a perfect example of what you do not do under just war theory, which is send your people to live in land that's already occupied by other people. Does that answer? What do you think?
Well, I have read that the Hamas guerrilla fighters have deep respect for the Jewish fighters who rose up at the
Oh, I'm sure they
their
do.
role models.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It totally does.
I think also, once you open a floodgate, probably there were people who participated in this who were not exactly under the discipline of Hamas. I have no idea what Hamas's actual, rules of engagement were. Yeah.
Given how serious this issue is and how many churches in Marin have been thinking about this, and PCUSA has been involved with BDS, at least some aspects of it for many years, it just seems to me that the response possibly, at the beginning in October, there was one response, but we have really maintained the same response, even though the issue has been getting worse and worse. And I am just wondering whether it's not time for at least Presbyterians who have supported BDS to say more about this as a group.
It's a very good question. I don't know much about your polity, like how the Presbyterian Church is run, but maybe Scott has some ideas about how, how you can get a more unified response than even a single congregation, but a national response.
Yeah, well, there are folks here who've been that at the national response. We have an every 2-year General Assembly, and churches can move presbyteries to move those national assemblies.
But that's every 2 years.
And we have one coming up in July. June or July.
And what's the plan?
We have sent, what is the one that the session sent that it's not, the one that, this church historically has sent those overtures, including San Francisco Presbytery, particularly because of the involvement of Walt Davis between those two.
And Dave Jones. I think this church is sending the education on apartheid.
Okay.
And Presbyterian Peace Fellowship has put its imprimatur on that.
Okay.
So there's a number of things in the works.
Yeah.
But I don't know what else is coming out through the other presbyteries.
So my polity also has General Convention this year, and one of my friend Sarah Lawton, who goes to St. John's where I go, has been working very hard on the committee that deals with issues of Israel-Palestine, and there are plans to bring, a declaration to the General Convention. And I think your point is very well taken, that churches are one of the places where people are already organized, right? You already have a group. So it's a very good place to work from, especially a group that comes, out of a tradition that says the divine became human, and therefore, how can we not respect that and that which is human, right? And I think that it is time, and it's hard to know, what it takes. You never know what it's going to take to get that wave. It's like surfing, right? You're sitting out there waiting for the wave, waiting for the wave, waiting for the wave, and then sometimes there it is, and you have to be ready to seize it. Well, I think you need to be organized and be ready.
Well, and I've been to a General Assembly where Israel has been so concerned about what the Presbyterians are going to say that they've sent representatives.
Yeah.
To speak at the
So it
General
matters.
Assembly
It matters
tell
to
us
them.
why the advocacy is off base.
Right.
And this was on things of lesser moment than what we're talking about. But it was. I was just like, Israel sent somebody to, like sent a government official
Oh, yeah.
to General Assembly.
Yeah, they care. I'm sure they'll be at our.
And it was very high-handed the way they spoke to us too. The other thing is there's an Israel-Palestine mission network that is a established continuing advocacy network that's a part of the Peace USA. I don't know that it's funded by that, but Dave Jones of our church is on their board.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, this is all super important. And of course, Peter and I were talking before about the election that's coming up. And, you know, I know one of the things that's very hard for many of us is being able to support a Biden candidacy given, you know, what's gone on. And also given what he's now about to do at the US border. He's talking about being willing to completely shut the US border in return for funding for Israel and Ukraine. And, you know, it's going to be really hard. All I can say is to people who live in California, you can vote your conscience and it won't matter because Biden is going to win this state, right? So, but there are a lot of people who don't have that luxury. And I personally believe it still matters if we defeat Trump. And that an election is not about, it's not about a candidate as a human being as much as it is about what is likely to happen as a result of that election. And all I can say is that Trump would not make the situation in Israel-Palestine any better than it is now. And would, you know, make it worse, if that's even possible. But that's my personal opinion, and I know that there are disagreements even within this congregation, and I think it's a very useful thing to talk about, because we're going to have work to do. This is 2024. There's going to be work to do, if not about the presidency, about, you know, congressional campaigns, about holding on to the Senate. Anyway, that's for another day. I'll come talk to you about work in Nevada. But thank you so much.